Otávio Brandão was not just a farmer. It was a legend of arrogance and power in the Goian Cerrado. Owner of more than 40,000 hectares, he made a point of showing his supremacy through his possessions: imported tractors, refined genetics cattle, and a mansion with white marble columns in the middle of nowhere. His farm, called Paraíso das Brisas, was known more for the shouts of the pedestrians than by the corner of the birds. What no one dared to say aloud is that much of that empire was born from the mud: land grabbing, falsification of scripture, and excuses agreements with regional politicians. Simple men lost their pieces of ground as Octavius grew. Who protested disappeared or was bought. He believed that the earth did not belong to those who cultivated it, but to those who could pay to take it. Among his most talked about trophies was the Bravio bull, an animal of more than 1 ton, winner of 7 national rodeos. The animal was kept in a special corral with care worthy of an Olympic athlete. They said Otávio liked to scare visitors, loosening Brazil just to see the dread in his eyes. Otávio was walking with a white hat and alligator leather boots, always accompanied by 2 armed security and a cold look. For him, there was no room for weakness. Her land was her throne, and anyone who invaded her, even if it was a shadow, was considered enemy. On the edge of the dusty road that cut Otávio's property, there was an ancient, centenary gamalira whose branches seemed to embrace the world. Under his shadow, a man slept. Dirty, with torn clothes and swollen feet, the old man was almost invisible for those who passed hastily. But there he was, muttering words to the wind as if he told forgotten stories. His name was unknown, but the few who crossed with him called him from the earth. He carried a carved piece of wood and a red scarf tied to his neck. Dogs in the region respected him, and birds were not startled by his presence. He walked from time to time, but always returned to that tree as if it were a safe haven. That morning, Zeta Earth arrived more downcast than usual. He sat down, leaned his back on the ranked trunk of the gamalira, and closed his eyes. There was a tiredness that went beyond the physical. It was the exhaustion of decades, buried stories, lost lands, and memories that burned like the Cerrado sun. The old man fell asleep without knowing that that land where he restrained had owner, a man who was not tolerated unauthorized presences. And what was just a landing for him, for Otávio Brandão, would be interpreted as an act of invasion. When warned by one of his pedestrians that there was a human trap sleeping in the backpack, Otávio exploded in fury. The presence of a wanderer in his lands was a personal affront. He went up in his armored pickup truck with 2 of his men and went to the place with eyes sparkling hatred. Once there, he went down with firm and heavy steps as if the earth trembled under his boots. He saw the old man sleeping, serene, and that raged him even more. "It's not a vagabond shelter," he shouted, kicking the dust next to Zeta Earth, who woke up scared but didn't get up. The old man looked at Otávio with calm eyes, as who has seen everything in his life. Did not answer. He didn't apologize. Just stayed there staring. It destabilized the farmer. No one looked at him that way, without fear. No reverence. It was then that Octavius had a cruel idea to give a definitive lesson. "Up the Brazil," he ordered. His men hesitated. "Up now," he shouted. For him, it would be a filmed lesson. An example of authority. I didn't want to kill the old man, just show the terror, or at least that's what he said. But nature had different plans. The corral gate was opened with a metallic ranger, and the ground trembled under the bravest hooves. The bull shot, sniffing the air, stinging with the usual anger. It was an animal trained for the clash, whose red eyes reflected brute strength. All the forefront have moved away from danger. Bravio ran toward the old man, who was still immovable under the gamalira. Otávio smiled, already imagining the panic stamped on the man's face. But as the bull approached, something strange began to happen. The animal reduced the speed, lowered its head, and changed its posture. The silence fell like a heavy curtain. Bravius stopped less than 2 meters from Earth. The bull snorted once, he looked at the old man, and then before everyone's unbelieving gaze, he knelt. Yes, the colossus knelt down as if it came to reverence. Then he lay down beside the man and began to lick his hand. Otávio widened his eyes. One of his men dropped his cell phone. No one could understand. It was as if the bull had recognized someone who was part of his soul. As if something ancestral had spoken louder than training, than fury, than instinct. The first to pronounce was his Dursu, the oldest foreman. "This animal never did it, boss." "Never." Her voice trembled, not fear of the bull, but something bigger, more invisible. A collective shiver ran through the spine of the men present, as if they had witnessed a miracle. Octavius tried to find a rational explanation. "Damn, you must be sick or sedated." But his words sounded weak, hollow of certainty. His eyes shaved. The image of Brazil, his weapon, his fury, his symbol of dominion, Kneeling before a beggar was something that hurt his pride with invisible blades. Zeta Earth said nothing. He just caressed the bull's head as an old friend again. It murmured words that no one understood, almost a low, old corner. Bravio closed his eyes. It was as if that melody cherished him like a puppy on his mother's lap. One of the pawns, young, took off his cell phone and recorded discreetly. The people need to see this, he murmured. That night, the video would begin to circulate between groups of WhatsApp, and the next day, the whole of Brazil would have a new question in the mouth. Who is this old man who made a monster bend? The video was just over a minute. He was filmed by Bento, a 19-year-old boy, newly hired as a field assistant on the farm. He did not intend to cause fuss, he just felt, in the bottom of his chest, that he was witnessing something bigger than himself. As soon as he saw Bravio Niels, he took his cell phone out of his pocket and recorded almost without breathing. The images showed the bull stopping before the old man, bending slowly until he rests his head on his lap. In the background, the sound of the wind was heard by cutting the leaves of the gamalira, and in the background, the trembling voice of one of the pawns saying, "This is impossible." Bento edited nothing. He posted the video in the village group where he lived, and in less than 20 minutes, he had already been passed on to more than 50 contacts. Hours later, the video arrived at a journalist from Goiânia who quickly identified the location by the landscape and the local recognition of the Otávio Brandão farm. The title of the viral video was simple but powerful, "The Bull That Bent." And with him came the avalanche. The next morning, reporters began to call the farm number, local press vehicles mobilized, and even a documentary filmmaker from São Paulo took a road to the countryside. What was just another abuse of power about to occur had become a national mystery. And the center of everything was no longer Octavius, it was Zeta Earth. The image of the Bravio bull kneeling before an old beggar was not just shocking, it was symbolic. For many, it represented an inversion of forces, the symbol of brutality surrendering to meekness, the creature created for the clash recognizing a deeper bond than the shouts of rodeo. It was as if nature was emitting a silent verdict before all. In the following days, animal behavior experts were invited by TV shows to analyze the video. Most said there was no scientific explanation. "No bull, especially one of high performance, acts like this by chance," commented a live biologist. Already an old tamer from the interior of Mato Grosso, interviewed by telephone, summarized with popular wisdom, this animal remembered who taught him to be an animal. Meanwhile, Otávio Brandão went into emotional and media collapse. He tried to deny the facts, accusing the montage video. Then he threatened to sue the boy he filmed. Finally, in an act of despair, he tried to bribe press vehicles so as not to publish. But it was too late. The truth or the mystery had already spread like fire in dry straw. In the city, the children began to play Zeta Earth and Bravio in the school courtyard. At the fairs, shirts with the kneeling bull print were sold. Something had changed. That image had touched a collective wound, that of a country used to seeing the weak being crushed, and now, for the first time, the force bowed to dignity. On the night of the event, while the forefront still whispered and Octavius locked themselves in his office trying to understand the inexplicable, Zeta Earth remained there under the gamalira, next to Brazil. The bull did not roundfoot. And it was then that the old man started singing, a melody that seemed to come from the dry ground, from the twisted branches, from the buried weather. The song was simple, with few notes, but carried an old pain. It was a corner of country, sertanejo, sung by deep interior peasants to tame animals and calm children. None of the pawns knew that song, but everyone who heard her later, in the recorded videos, swore they felt their hearts tighten. There was something there could not explain. Bravio reacted to the sound like a calf before his mother. He closed his eyes. Breathed the compassionate. From time to time he resumed in response to the old man's compass. It was as if each grade excavated memories buried in the animal's instinct. The video of that night, recorded by Bento in silence, captured the song and further spread the fascination with the old stranger. It was the first time the country heard Zeta Earth's voice. But to the bull, it was not the first. That song was not just a sound, it was a reunion. And Brazil, as if guided by the soul, had remembered who, long before the name, Otávio Brandão, had treated him with respect, fire in his eyes and tenderness in his hands. In the backlands, the news ran faster than a report. Even before the first television teams arrived, the story of the old man who tamed a bull with a corner was already crossing villages, floor roads, and viola wheels. In every corner of the interior, someone told his version of the incident, and each version added a magical detail. Some said the old man was a prayer, others which he had returned from the dead. The elders began to get uneasy. Ancient names began to resurface from memories. Zeta Earth? That name reminds me of Jose Honorio, the one who disappeared in the flood of 78. He said, an elder in the Jaragua stone market. Gradually, fragments of the past began to fit, like pieces of a puzzle buried under years of silence, fear, and injustice. On a community radio, a listener called and said in an embargoed voice, this old man who appeared with the bull. He worked with my father. It was the best tamer this backwoods. The connection aired and the commotion grew. The old man was no longer just a wanderer. He was a legend coming back to charge his story. Meanwhile, Otávio Brandão was beginning to be pressured by something he never expected, the ghost of collective memory. His men dozed. His neighbors avoided him. And the earth which once obeyed him now seemed to murmur the name of another owner. A name that the wind spread with reverence, Jose Honorio dos Anjos. With each passing day, more people appeared on the edge of the paradise of the Brisas farm. Some came from afar, some were old neighbors who never dared to cross Octavius's fences. But now, moved by something bigger than curiosity, they wanted to see the man who had made a bull kneel. Some wanted to touch him, some just hear his voice. Zeta Earth, however, remained silent, observing everything with damp and firm eyes. A group of activists, accompanying independent journalists, managed to approach and offered help to identify the old man. They took pictures, crossed data with civil records and care institutions. In a short time, they found that Zeta Earth did not exist in official records. No document, no birth record, nothing. It was as if he were a spirit. But then the turn came. A lady named Dona Arlinda, resident of a village named São Bartolomeu das Pedras, called the radio stating that she recognized him for the images. It is he, yes. Zé Honorio, the boy of his inigio. He worked with Bravo Boy, but disappeared at the flood. They swore he died, but my heart always said no. Revelation burned social networks. Zeta Earth neither confirmed nor denied. He just lowered his head as if he carries the weight of a name too old to say aloud. But in his eyes, he shone for a moment the reflection of a time when he was someone before he was forgotten. The mystery of the old man began to untie his nodes, and the whole of Brazil wanted to know who erased the story of José Honorio dos Anjos. With the revelation of the name José Honorio dos Anjos, something deep moved in the heart of the surrounding communities. Those who had swallowed for decades and silent before Otávio Brandão's power began to speak. The presence of the once invisible old man was now like a spark that rekindled sleeping memories. At the Anacon's fair, an old drover said that José Honorio was known as the man who tamed with the soul. He was said that he was talking to the oxen, who treated the offspring with lulis, and that no animals dare to face him. He didn't beat, he respected. So the animals obeyed him, said the man, with tears in his eyes. The story spread quickly, and each testimony brought more credibility to the past of the old. Others remembered a farm called Cedro Retiro mysteriously missing after the full of the Sambura River in 1978. At the time, it was said that the flood took everything: home, cattle, people. But now, with the pieces returning to the board, they began to suspect that this tragedy had only been a facade for something more wicked, a camouflage of natural disaster. The reports became dossiers. Young activists started documenting everything: testimonials, old photos, blurred documents of neighboring notaries. And gradually, a consistent portrait arose. José Honorio dos Anjos had been erased, but not destroyed. The people who were once afraid now found in the figure of the olden ancestral force. A living resistance. A story that refused to die. The name José Honorio dos Anjos emerged in the records as a stained shadow of silence. In an abandoned registry office in the municipality of Goiás Velho, a yellowish sheet with trembled handwriting was signed in a land tenure contract dated 1975. The Retiro do Cedro farm with its 80-4 hectares was still in his name. It was a forgotten proof, drowned out for decades but still alive. The discovery was received with euphoria by journalists and astonishment by local residents. Many had already heard that name in childhood, told as legend or tragedy. A righteous man who treated his pedestrians as brothers, who built fences only to protect the flock, never to separate the people. When he disappeared on the flood, the pain was, but the truth was buried along with the mud that took the farm. More documents began to emerge. A bodiless certificate. A sales certificate with forged signature. Police reports ignored. Everything pointed to a carefully assembled scam. Someone had benefited from the disappearance of José Honorio, and this one, according to the tracks, was Antero Brandão, father of Otávio, a kernel of influence at the time of the dictatorship. Otávio, confronted by reporters about his family's past, denied everything. He said he never heard of José Honorio. But the eyes denounced the panic. It was as if the land that supported its empire began to crumble inside. And from the bottom of this crack, the name that was forgotten now echoed hard, José Honorio dos Anjos, the true owner of the story. The discovery of the documents caused a domino effect. Land law lawyers volunteered to investigate the case. One of them, Dr. Elias Moray, a repossession specialist, traveled from Brasilia to the farm to meet personally with Zeta Earth. When he saw the old man, his eyes made it. The Lord is the owner of all this and does not know the power he has in his hands. Old bank records were found on behalf of José Honorio showing cattle sales deposits, milk sales invoices, and even a denying loan shortly before his disappearance. The pattern was clear. Someone wanted the land and made the owner disappear, using the flood as a smoke curtain. The transition from the property to the Brandão made weeks after the alleged death smelled the fraud. Octavius, realizing that the siege was closing, gathered his lawyers. They tried to claim adverse possession for continuous use of the earth, but the strategy was fragile in the face of new evidence that the domain had been forcibly taken, with dubious documents and corruption in local instances. José Honorio's inheritance was not just a piece of ground, it was a symbol of crushed dignity and buried by ambition. Meanwhile, Zeta Earth, sitting in the shadow of the Gamaliera, listened to everything in silence. When they asked him what he would do with the lands if justice was done, he replied only, "The earth is not the one who surrounds, it is the one who cares." And in that phrase, simple as the wet earth, there was a world of truths that no property title could erase. In the heart of the small town of Piracanjuba, an old registry was resting between a pharmacy and a feed sales. Falling ink from the facade hid decades of stories stored in wooden files smelling the mold. It was there that Elias Moray's team of lawyers found the missing thread to sew José Honorio's past and unmasked the blow to him. In a muffled room hidden between hand-bound books, dragged and poorly archived documents emerged. One of them was a fake power of attorney allegedly signed by José Honorio authorizing the sale of the farm Retiro from Cedro to an agricultural investor. The signature, when compared to previous records, was visibly different, a grotesque falsification. The notary's seal also had inconsistencies, and the name of the responsible notary had never been found in official records of the time. The most terrifying was a manuscript hidden within a time-packed envelope signed by the 1978 assistant notary. In it, in a confession, the employee stated that he had been pressured by local political forces to legalize an illegal transaction. He directly mentioned Otávio Brandão, the father of Octavius, as the man behind the frame. The notary said he regretted but feared for his life. The letter has never been sent, never delivered, but now it emerged as an undisputed proof of a generation crime. The discovery generated a devastating impact. The prosecutor was called and the investigation was urgently opened. For the first time in decades, the official narrative was starting to crumble. Otávio, heir to an empire built on lies, was now seen not as a powerful man, but as the son of a fraud. And José Honorio, the old silent who slept under the Gamaliera, was recognized as the legitimate lord of that stolen land. Bravio was known for his strength, but there was something more in that animal that made him unique. He did not accept any tamer. He was aggressive with keepers, unpredictable in the rodeos, and only obeyed commands that had never been taught by anyone on the Octavian team. That wild temperament, which was so frightened, hid a secret and was about to be revealed. After the viral video and the testimonials about José Honorio, a former cowboy named Antonio Nico, now retired, sought out the press and said something that would change everything. Bravius was not born on this farm. He is the grandson of a bull created by José Honorio Calunga. The man explained that, years ago, during the acquisition of the old farm, a lot of animals had been integrated into the new herd, and among them was the matrix from which Brazil descended. More than genetics, what went from generation to generation between those oxen was the bond with the voice and gesture of José Honorio. The old tamer's methods were different. He did not wear whip or scream. His commands came with whistles, words of affection, and songs that calmed up to the angry of the animals. It was a kind of silent language transmitted by coexistence and respect. And Brazil, even without ever being touched by Joseph, kept this memory in the blood and soul. When Zeta Earth first caressed the bull, it was not a reunion, it was the fulfillment of a cycle. It was as if, in the calm touch of his calloused hands, Brazil had found the point of origin where he had been imagined, desired, formed. And at that moment, before all, it was clear that no fence, no record, and no million reis could compete with the silent authority of those who know how to create with love. The 1978 flood had been violent but selective. It rained for 3 days and 3 nights, making the Sambura River overflow, invading plantations and destroying small riverside buildings. But many residents of the time began to revisit events with distrust. Why was the farm of Jose Honorio only swallowed? They were asked now. At the time, no one dared to question. Today, the memories came back as distant thunder. According to reports, Jose Honorio was last seen walking towards the corral alongside his wife and small godson, trying to save the animals from the rise of the waters. Then silence. What was heard the next morning was that the wooden hut was disappeared and the bodies were never found. The official explanation taken by the current. But now, in the face of Joseph's proof and reappearance, the official version seemed a poorly rehearsed theater. Dona Arlinda, the same lady who recognized Joseph on TV, revealed something even darker. She remembered gunmen prowling the property on the eve of the flood. He said her husband saw strange trucks parked in the woods. They seemed to be expecting something or someone. In fear, at the time, they were silent. But now, memory was like a cracked dam, impossible to contain. Jose Honorio, when asked about that night, took a long time to answer. After a long silence, he said only, "I saw the water arrive. But what knocked me down was the fire." He didn't explain anything more. But in his eyes there was the pain of those who have overcome not by nature but by evil disguised as a tragedy. And the 1978 waters, which erased their name, now came back in the form of truth, invading the foundations of those who built an empire about lies. Among the men who faithfully served the Brandão family for years, few carried the heavy gaze of Amaro Candido, a retired foreman who lives around Itaboraí. When the newspapers began to open the case of Jose Honorio, Amaro disappeared from sight. "I did not answer phone, did not receive visits." It was as if the past had come back to charge him with interest in a lifetime. It was Benedict, the young man who had recorded the video of Brazil, who found him by chance in a walking bodega. The boy showed him a picture of the old man under the game. Seeing Jose Honorio's face, Amaro paled, spilling the cachaca glass he held. Is he alive?" he asked, how who sees a ghost. From then on, something broke inside him. 2 days later, Amaro sought a lawyer and voluntarily recorded a statement. In it revealed in detail the plan orchestrated by Otávio Brandão. He said he had been forced to take his henchmen to Joseph's farm the night before the flood. They had set fire to the barn to make him run to Rio. The water was already rising. "That's what they did. I only obeyed orders." His voice in the video was from a man consumed by guilt. Confession fell as a dynamite in the investigation. For the first time, a direct witness assumed that Joseph's disappearance had not been an accident but part of a premeditated crime. The recording ran the country, won the night newscasts, and more than anything, gave face to the executors of silence. Amaro, broken and sick, said only that he wanted to sleep in peace. Jose Honorio, upon hearing of confession, muttered he was also a slave to fear. Now he is free. The Paraíso das Brisas farm, accustomed to the silence of the oxen and the bang of tractors, became, overnight, the epicenter of a national commotion. Reporting cars, drones, cameras, and microphones spread like hungry termites in search of the story that now dominated the headlines: the old and the bull, the land that rebelled. Large broadcasters' reporters camped on the edge of the farm, trying to capture images of Jose Honorio. Some were trying to interview, others just sought to record a gesture, a sentence, a look. But Zeta Earth, as he was still called by many, remained faithful to his silence. Sitting under the gamalira, he looked at the horizon as if he already knew the world, now turning his eyes to him, but his thoughts were at another time. A young journalist named Natalia Duarte managed to approach more respect. Did not use cameras. He sat next to the silent old man for 3 days. In the room, he said, "My story is from the floor. If you want to understand, take off your shoes." The reporter walked barefoot with him among the high grasses, heard her intertwined memories, saw her hands touch the earth as who meets a lost son. She was the one who first wrote, "The land remembers who loved her." Natalia's report aired the following Sunday. With gentle images, without sensationalism, he told the story with the delicacy she demanded. Brazil stopped. Cry. Wondered. For the first time, it was not the cry that occupied the center of the narrative, but the whisper of a man who, even silent for decades, had made the world listen. And in the background, as a soundtrack, the serene Bravio always next to the old man. The Monday following the report by Natalia Duarte, the original video of Bento, the same as Bravio kneeling, was shown in the Jornal Nacional, entitled "To the Analysis of Experts, Popular Testimonials and an Emotional Editorial." But it was the simplicity of the scene that made the country stop: an old man with beaten clothes, a surrender bull, and the most eloquent silence that had ever crossed the screen of a television. The reaction was immediate. Millions shared the video on social networks using the hashtag #JusticeAparajosahorio. In less than 24 hours, celebrities, jurists, country singers, and even parliamentarians have spoken. "I have never seen an animal be more aware of justice than many men," wrote a retired judge. Bravius' image has become a symbol of resistance, stamped on posters, shirts, and urban murals of large cities. The country not only watched, but felt. The old silent represented a forgotten, stepped, silenced for generations. The bull, a symbol of strength and brutality, was now the living metaphor of redemption, of rescued memory, of the earth that refuses to be silent. Children recited the history of Zeta Earth in schools. Teachers used the case to teach about ethics, possession, memory, and ancestry. Otávio Brandão tried to react. He gave rehearsed interviews, blamed, invented narratives, disqualified the documents. But everything sounded false in the face of the spontaneous force of an image that no one could forget. The country had already made your choice. And it was no longer Octavius who had the power of the word. It was that simple man, sitting under a tree with the earth in his hands and the truth in his eyes. After the national commotion caused by the video, scholars began to analyze not only the legal aspects of the case, but also the symbolic and cultural elements involved. Anthropologists, Quilombola leaders, and indigenous shamans began to visit the region, recognizing there a crossing point between ancestral memories and contemporary injustices. And the more you heard José Honorio in her silences and gestures, the more she understood that he was not just a man, he was the echo of an entire people. It was said that his mother was descended from a Cerrado midwife and prayer lineage. His father, a meat cattle, had taught him from a child the language of the winds, the animals, the rains. The songs that Zay chanting Bravio did not come from radios or booklets, but of an oral tradition that mixed ritual, affection, and resistance. When asked about his songs, he answered only, "They are not mine. They came before." A group of Avacanairo indigenous people acknowledged, in parts of the melodies sung by Zay, fragments of old prayers they thought lost. A chief said in an interview, "This man carries the breath of those that the earth did not let." It was more than a reunion with his own history, it was the reconnection of a Brazil amputated Brazil. And while the courts began to move, the collective spirit that was formed around José Honorio made it clear, there was not just about returning a farm, but of cure an open wound for centuries of injustice. And in that piece of ground, under the shadow of a gamalira and the attentive look of a 1,000-pound bull, the country was finally beginning to listen to the buried voices that asked for a passage. The barbed wire fence that delimited the entrance of Paraíso das Brisas farm suddenly became the most symbolic point of the state. It was there that, on a clean sky Saturday, thousands of people began to arrive, on foot, by bicycle, on old cars, on canvas trucks, and even horseback. There was no formal organization, no party, no flags, only hand-made posters and embargoed voices of emotion. Some brought posters with phrases such as "The Earth Remembers," "Bravio knelt," "Now it's our turn," and "José Honorio live." Others just sat under the trees, in silence, as if paying tribute. The place became almost a popular sanctuary where simple people left offerings of the earth, roots, seeds, pieces of wood sculpted with love. Even singers arrived, and the gamalira under which the old man used to rest became an altar and stage. Local authorities at first tried to minimize the movement. They said it was emotional exaggeration. But the manifestation grew. Press vehicles broadcast live. Digital influencers descended to the scene, and even renowned artists appeared to provide support. The people of the backlands, historically marginalized, now occupied space with dignity. And what was born as solidarity with an old man became a collective cry for reparation. Otávio Brandão, from inside his glazed mansion, watched on TV with trembling hands. He didn't dare to leave, surrounded by increasingly restless security guards. With each passing time, his dominion over that earth was faded like water between his fingers. He had scripture, titles, helicopters, but he no longer had the people. And when the people join the past, there is no empire that resists. The fall of Otávio Brandão was not as in revenge novels, it was more cruel, it was public, gradual, and inevitable. It began with the freezing of bank accounts, by court order, after the suspicion of irregular movements on behalf of ghost companies linked to the purchase of José Honorio lands. Then came the requests for research by land grabbing, notarial corruption, and ruralist gang formation. The media, formerly far from the interior land issues, now devoted hours of programming to history. Documents came to light, denunciate repaired for years have finally gained voice, and farm staff began asking for removal or giving compromising interviews. The silence that once surrounded the name Brandão was now replaced by accusations, headlines, and popular outrage. In the agricultural scholarship, companies linked to the Otávio group suffered chain devaluation. Trade partners rescinded contracts. And politicians who once frequented their barbecues disappeared as a dust carried by the wind. The man who had bulls to intimidate beggars now walked the corridors of his own house murmuring to himself under the cold eyes of security cameras that protected nothing more. But the final blow came from where he least expected. Brazil fled. On a silent afternoon, the bull broke the electric fence and was seen walking slowly on the dirt road toward the Gamaleira. It did not knock anything down. It did not attack anyone. Just was. And when he arrived, he lay down next to José Honorio as a son who chooses without noise to whom he calls his father. Octavius, knowing this, sat on the floor and cried. It wasn't just the animal he had lost. It was the symbol of everything he pretended to be and never was. The Palmeiras de Goiás City Forum had never received so much attention. That day, the chairs of the small auditorium were occupied by journalists, lawyers, peasants, and curious. There was something sacred in the air, as if, for the first time, official justice had to hear what the earth had shouted for a long time. In the center of everything, sitting with straight posture and calm look, was José Honorio dos Anjos. The judge responsible for the audience, an austere expression woman named Dr. Miriam Candido, opened the work with formality. The process was clear: dispute of possession, annulment of scriptures, and request for reintegration of goods. But no protocol would be able to contain the emotional weight that would take over the room when José Honorio, in his first public speech in decades, asked for the word. He got up with difficulty, backed by a makeshift cane made of arrow branch. He looked at those present and said, in a firm but sweet voice, "I was buried alive for this land. But she kept me as a seed in dry weather." He spoke of his childhood, the love of animals, the night of the flood, the shots he heard before the water climbed. His speech was not theatrical, it was testimony. When it ended, there was silence. The judge swallowed hard. No lawyer dared to interrupt. Otávio, summoned to testify, tried to support his version. But his words were made of stones, hard, heavy, and empty. At the end of the session, Dr. Miriam ended by saying, "Justice is not just done with evidence. It is done with memory." And today, she has breathed again for these bans. The audience was closed, but everyone knew the sentence was already written on the wrinkles of that face that the earth refused to forget. The repossession was granted on an injunction. The Fazenda Retiro do Cedro, now legally recognized as belonging to José Honorio dos Anjos, was about to be returned. The name was taken from the Brandão records and rewritten in the earth books where it should never have been erased. But more than a legal act, it was a spiritual return and adjustment between man and ground. On the morning of the symbolic return, hundreds of people accompanied Joseph to the area where before the headquarters of the former farm, today an empty pasture taken by the Colonian grass. The old man walked slowly with Brazil beside him like a guardian. Bento, Natalia Duarte, activists, representatives of the traditional peoples and residents of the region made a human corridor of silence and respect. Arriving in the old yard, Joseph kneeled. He took a handful of land, smelled like a mother's perfume, and murmured, "You're still here." Then he pointed to the calcined trunk of a partially burned hose decades earlier. "It was here that my wife sang. And there, my godson learned to lock the wind." The emotion was dense. That place, considered dead for so long, still whispered stories for those who knew how to hear. Dona Arlinda, present at the ceremony, stated softly, "This place is alive. It is legend that goes, that breathes." And in fact, it wasn't just Joseph coming back. The ones who were gone, the ones who were silent, those who resisted. In that piece of ground soaked by old tears, Brazil saw something stronger than time, dignity sprouting as a flower on dry land. And before all, José Honorio replanted the first sprout of a hose, celebrating not victory but the Renaissance. Otávio Brandão was summoned to personally appear to the headquarters of the Federal Agrarian Court of Goiânia. It was no longer the same man who crossed the city in armored cars and shining leather boots, escorted, downcast, with the deep dark circles of those who slept next to the past. When descending from the vehicle, he found a crowd in silence, holding posters with the image of José Honorio and the verses, "He who is born of the earth is never forgotten by her." In the audit room, the climate was sober but loaded with expectation. For the first time, José Honorio and Otávio Brandão looked at each other. The old man was erect, without anger in his eyes, just an old tiredness that time and justice seemed, little by little, to relieve. Octavius looked small. When the judge asked if he had something to say, he hesitated. I was raised with the truth they gave me. But she was a lie, he said. I don't ask for forgiveness. I wouldn't have that right. I just want to leave. Jose Honorio remained silent. When they asked him if he wanted to make any requirement or formal request for financial repair, he replied, I don't want the money born of the lie. I want you to return the trees, the animals, the dignity of the hands that worked here. And then it surprised everyone by asking part of the land to be transformed into a community agroecological reserve with rural schools, healing space, and reforestation. The judge, thrilled, granted the request as part of the court agreement. Justice there was no longer revenge and became collective rebirth. Octavius came out through the back door in funeral silence. Joseph walked slowly, surrounded by children from the local rural school who were waiting for him to plant seedlings in the old yard. It was the end of an era. And the beginning of something that not even the books would have to count on the strength that the floor now carried. It was a warm afternoon when Jose Honorio returned to the countryside, no longer like an unnamed wanderer but as the guardian restored from the earth. The walk to the old corral was solemn. Behind him were residents of the region, children from the newly created school, attentive journalists, and a few cowboys who had left the Brandão to work voluntarily in reconstructing the cedar retreat. Upon arriving at the old pasture where the oxen now fired freely without fear of shock or command voice, Jose Honorio stopped before the gate and took off his hat. He whistled a melody that seemed to have been kept somewhere between the bones and the soul. The sound crossed the field like a hot breeze, and the previously scattered animals began to approach slowly as one who recognizes an ancient presence. The eldest of the oxen, a calm and forehead look marked by a scar of hard times, was the first to kneel. Then one by one, the others did the same. It was not a trained act. It was not submission. It was recognition. The men got real, the children stopped laughing, and even the cicadas shut up for a moment. There, under the heaven of the Cerrado, the oxen bend not to a man, but to the memory of those who created them with respect. Bravio, who now lived free in the countryside, was the last to approach. He lay next to Joseph as he had done on the first date and supported his head on his feet. Joseph just caressed her back and said, now you don't have to fight anymore. It may be just what it is. It was the closure of a cycle where the animal created for the clash found peace and the man forged in pain, finally, found rest. The earth at that moment no longer needed to speak. She had been heard. Over the months, the Retiro do Cedro farm is no longer just a rural property to becoming a sacred territory of healing and reconnecting. The land previously explored to the limit was carefully regenerated with the help of local agronomists, quilombolas, and local peasants. It has planted what feeds, what heals, and what perfumes, and also what protects. It was the rebirth of a territory but also of his soul. The old wire fences were replaced by livewood, ipes, and flamboyance barriers in a proposal of integration between man and the countryside. The children learned to plant and spoon, but also to hear the earth. Jose Honorio insisted the soil misses it. When he is treated again, he returns. First silence, then abundance. The old host house was reconstructed not as a mansion but as a center of memory and rural knowledge where visitors could know the history of the region, ancestral corners, traditional cultivation modes, and errors that should never be repeated again. There, exposed in reused wood frames, were the roles that had almost buried Joseph's life, now transformed into resistance testimonies. And in the heart of everything, Jose Honorio walked among the flower beds with the same hat spent, the arila cane, and the eyes attentive. He was no longer the lord of anything, and perhaps for that very reason he was the real guardian of everything. The earth, washed in tears, blood, and songs, had finally rediscovered his spirit. And the people, in the face of that landscape that flourished again, knew that what had been recovered there was not just territory, it was true, it was dignity, it was history. Otávio Brandão now lived in prison in an isolated farm on the border with Minas Gerais. His assets had been blocked, their properties pledged, and their reputation destroyed. There were no more employees, only the silence and shadow of the decisions that condemned him daily. He had aged suddenly. He walked by dragging his feet and talking little as if the world had shrunk to the size of his own mistakes. One day discreetly wrote a letter. He asked him to be handed over to Jose Honorio. It was not extensive. Did not ask for acquittal. He said, I was born heir to an empire built on the robbery of his ground. It was not me who lit the fire, but I was the one who fed it. Today I live between walls of guilt. If my name can someday be remembered shameless, that is for this gesture, return what was never mine. The letter reached Joseph's hands in a low sun dusk. He read calmly without visible emotion. He spent a while looking at the paper and then kept it between the pages of a notebook where he wrote his memories. When Benedict asked him if he would forgive, he answered, "Only there is something that is not forgiven, boy, but surpasses. And sometimes that is enough." Days later, a messenger led Octavius a gameplay planted by Joseph's hands. Next to her, a short note: "Forgiveness is a difficult tree. It grows slowly, sometimes alone. But it grows." Octavius cried. Not with the relief of the innocent, but with the weight of those who know that regret does not erase, it only teaches how to carry what can no longer undo. Time has passed. Not as they pass to those who live in a hurry, but how it passes to earth, slowly, leaving signs in the stations, leaves silences. Jose Honorio aged with dignity. It was no longer so much, it was even less, but its presence was enough. When he appeared in the yard or sat in the shadow of the Gamaliera, everyone knew it was time to hear. It was in one of these silent afternoons that he called Bento, the boy who had recorded the video of Brazil. It was no longer a boy, now he was an agronomist formed, resident of the farm, master of children at the community school. Joseph stared at him for a while and said, "You saw when no one wanted to see. You believed when no one knew. It's with you." Bento did not answer immediately. The old words carried more than an invitation, they were a surrender. In the following days, Bento led the conversation wheels, supervising the plantations, keeping alive the simple rituals that Joseph had rescued, the prayers of thanks to the rain, the stories told around the fire, the teachings transmitted not with books, but with the way of walking through the bush. It was a new cycle, but made of the same sap. Jose Honorio then retreated to his definitive silence. He stopped appearing on the wheels. He just watched from the porch of his wooden house with teary eyes and quiet soul. Because now the earth had another name to call the guardian. A young name, but with a deep root. And there, under the sky of the Cerrado, between oxen, children, and trees that were flowering again, the backlands had been healed by its own people. One morning of cloudless blue sky, Jose Honorio left. He died as he has lived in recent years, serene, under the shadow of the Gamaliera, with his hat over his face and a handful of earth in his hands. There was no suffering. Just a light sigh, as if his spirit dissolved in the Cerrado wind. The animal stirred for a moment, then calmed down. And Brazil, old and tired, lay down with his friend's body and remained there in vigil. The wake was made in the yard of the cedar retreat, in wheel, as the old man liked it. There was no coffin. Only one network extended between two branches, surrounded by field flowers, seeds, and calloused hands. The school children sang the melody he used to whistle to the oxen, now turned into a hymn. There was no sadness. There was reverence. Zeta Earth, as they continued to call him, had turned root. Some say that in the silent dawn, the echo of that song is still heard in the open fields. Others swear that Bravius, before he died months later, walked alone to the Gamaliera in a soft mood as if he asked for permission to leave. But what is certain is that the story of Jose Honorio dos Anjos has never been told. In books, songs, strings, and movies, he became a living legend. And in every corner of Brazil where there is injustice, someone remembers the old man who tamed time with the silence, the land that bent his name, and the bull that taught the country to kneel in the face of the truth.